What's up everybody, welcome to build video number 1 for the Sakura D3 CS Sport. This video is going to cover steps 1 through 3 in the instruction manual. So, step 1 deals with the suspension arms and the belt tensioner. So let's get started. Here's a look at the parts needed to do the first part of step 1. We've got the suspension mounts both front and rear, as well as the suspension arms front and rear, and all the hardware needed to assemble them. The first thing we're going to do is take a 1 M3x12 button screw and screw it into the top side of the front suspension arms. Next we're going to take 1 M3x10 set screw and screw it into the front side of the front suspension arm, and the instruction manual says to leave about 5 millimeters protruding from the arm. Once the set screw is in place, you want to take a 5.8 millimeter ball stud and screw it onto the set screw. And when you're done with that, you want to repeat this process for the remaining front suspension arm. The rear suspension arms are going to be assembled the same way as the front suspension arms, starting with the 1 M3x12 button screw on the top side. The button screw is followed by screwing in the M3x10 set screw, leaving 5 millimeters protruding from the arm, and then installing the 5.8 millimeter ball stud. After we're done with the prep work on the suspension arms, we're going to loose fit the arms with the mounts, making sure we have one of these M3x6x1 plastic spacers on each side of the arm between the mounts and the arm. Now that we've got the suspension arm assemblies loose fitted, we're going to move on to assembling the belt tensioner for the rear belt, starting with putting the M3 lock nut in the groove on the back side of the belt tension post. The bearing for the tensioner gets sandwiched between the two pulley rings, and then that assembly will get screwed on to the post where the lock nut is. When the screw starts to get tight, you're going to want to grab a set of pliers and hold the lock nut from spinning. The plastic belt tension post tends to spread and allow the lock nut to spread it or spin if you don't. The instruction manual says to leave 3.5 millimeters from the top of the bearing to the top of the post. When I did this, I eyeballed it and it was just about dead on when I installed it. Now it's time to mount the suspension arm assemblies to the chassis. There's grooves on the chassis that the mounts slide into. This helps hold them steady while you're screwing them in. It can be a pain, I found it. If you can cover the whole thing with your hand on the top side while you're screwing from the back side, this will keep the parts from sliding off of the hinge pins and falling on the floor. But if you're having trouble, just mount the back side of the suspension mounts and then slide the hinge pins and the arms on, and then screw on the front side. You can see right here what I'm talking about it being a pain in the butt. All the arms on the rear fell off when I was doing this, so I just screwed the front side suspension mount in and then reassembled it and screwed the back ones in to hold it in place. Now it's time to mount the belt tension post. It's got a little post on the bottom side of it that aligns into the center hole on the chassis there. That does it for step one. Here's a couple still photos of the completed progress. Now it's time to move on to step two, which is the steering system. Step two, steering system. In this step we're going to be assembling the steering rack and mounting it to the chassis, as well as mounting the battery mount posts to the chassis. Alright, so the first thing we want to do is to screw in the 4.8mm ball studs to the steering arms. There's two on the right and one on the left. They're going to be screwed into the outermost holes. Next we're going to install the steering link onto the steering arms with two M3x8 button screws. When we do this, we're going to make sure to put the flange tubes through the bottom. This will allow the steering assembly to pivot with ease and not bind up on you. The steering rack assembly is now ready to mount onto the chassis. We're going to mount this by screwing on the two steering posts to the chassis with the M3x6 flat screws. And then we'll insert the bearings into the steering arms. There's two on each side, one on top, one on bottom. Then the assembly will slide down onto those steering posts, and we'll put a stainless steel shim spacer on top of each bearing and screw down the rack with two M3x4 button screws. For the last part of step two, we are going to screw down the battery mount posts to the chassis. These just get screwed down with M3x8 flat screws. When you're doing this, you want to make sure the hook is facing outward from the battery tray and to the outside of the chassis. This will make sure you have them all lined up, and that when you go to strap the battery down, the straps will line up and be straight and keep your battery secure. Now it's time for step 3, which is the front and rear bulkheads. Here is a look at some of the parts you'll need for this step. The first thing we're going to do is to screw together the front bulkhead. The right and left piece gets screwed together using the 2 aluminum posts, and the motor mount also gets screwed to the right side of the front bulkhead. You want to take note of the screw sizes. There's 2 different size screws used to mount the motor mount. Next, we're going to take the assembled front bulkhead and screw it to the chassis. Just like with the suspension arm assemblies, there are grooves in the chassis that the bulkhead will slip down into to keep it lined up, and you're just going to take the 6 M3x8 flat screws and screw it to the chassis. Now that we have the front bulkhead mounted, we're going to move on to the rear, which is a lot easier. All you're going to do is take the right and left pieces separately and secure them to the chassis with 2 M3x8 flat screws. Again, there are grooves in the chassis to line up the bulkheads, and that is the last step for step 3. Well guys, that concludes the first build video for the Sakura D3. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to see continued coverage of my build series, hit that subscribe button below. That'll keep you up to date with everything. And as always, thanks for watching.